Ever wondered how Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the 10th president of the Philippines, managed to hold on to power for 2 decades? Marcos, a name that rings with both accolades and controversies, was a political juggernaut in the Philippines. He was inaugurated as the 10th president of this island nation in 1965, a position he held onto with an iron grip until 1986. That's a total of 20 years. This period was marked by a complex tapestry of events, from economic growth and infrastructure development to martial law, corruption and human rights abuses. So how did one man manage to sustain his rule amid such turmoil? Was it his charisma, political acumen, or just sheer luck? Or perhaps a cocktail of all these factors? To understand this, we must venture back in time and examine the intricate details of his presidency. Let's delve into the timeline of his rule to unravel the mystery of his lengthy tenure. Marcos took office in 1965, but what were the initial years of his rule like? Ferdinand Marcos began his presidency with a bang. The nation was brimming with optimism, and rightly so. Marcos was charismatic, articulate, and seemed to embody the hope for a brighter future. His initial years in power were marked by a surge in popularity. He was the man of the hour, promising economic growth, social reform, and a strong national identity. And for a while it seemed like he was delivering on those promises. The Philippines saw a period of economic growth that was unprecedented in its history. The gross national product increased by an average of 6% annually, the highest in Asia at the time. Marcos also spearheaded massive infrastructure projects that modernized the country. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, the landscape of the Philippines was changing, and it seemed for the better. But beneath this veneer of progress, a different story was beginning to unfold. While the economy was booming and infrastructure was improving, the wealth gap was widening. The rich were getting richer while the poor were struggling to keep up. Critics began to question Marcos's policies, his handling of the economy, and the increasing signs of corruption within his administration. The turning point came in 1972 when Marcos declared martial law. He claimed it was necessary to suppress civil unrest and the threat of communist insurgency. But in reality, it was a strategic move to maintain his grip on power. It was a period marked by human rights abuses, political repression, and further economic decline. The declaration of martial law allowed Marcos to rule by decree. He silenced his critics, curbed freedom of the press, and stifled political opposition. The nation was under his thumb, and a sense of fear and uncertainty began to permeate the country. The declaration of martial law marked a significant turning point in his rule. Marcos' early years in power had started with promise and optimism, but ended in uncertainty and fear. The man who had once symbolized hope for the nation had become a symbol of oppression. Martial law, a term that still sends shivers down the spines of many Filipinos, but what did it mean for Marcos's rule? In 1972, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. declared martial law in the Philippines, a move that would mark a significant shift in his regime. Martial law essentially suspended civil rights and imposed military rule. It was a term that became synonymous with fear, oppression, and the silencing of dissent. Under the guise of quelling civil unrest and rooting out communist insurgents, Marcos was able to consolidate his power. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which meant that anyone could be arrested and detained without a warrant or trial. This gave him the ability to neutralize political opponents and critics, effectively silencing any voices of opposition. But it didn't stop there. Marcos also imposed strict censorship on the press. Newspapers, radio stations, and television networks were heavily monitored and controlled. Journalists who dared to criticize the government were met with threats and, in some cases, incarceration. This media blackout allowed Marcos to control the narrative, shaping public perception and maintaining a facade of peace and order. This period also saw the rise of crony capitalism. Marcos's close associates, known as his cronies, were given control of major industries and public utilities. This not only strengthened his political base, but also allowed him to amass a significant amount of wealth. Martial law lasted for almost a decade, and during this time, Marcos ruled with an iron fist. He used fear and intimidation to maintain control, stifling dissent and opposition at every turn. The Philippines became a country where dissent was dangerous, and freedom was a luxury few could afford. But with power comes corruption, and Marcos was no exception. His rule was marked by gross human rights abuses and rampant corruption. Yet, despite this, he managed to stay in power for another 6 years after the lifting of martial law. Marcos's authoritarian rule was starting to take shape, but how did he maintain it? Power is often maintained through unscrupulous means. So what role did corruption and nepotism play in Marcos's rule? Well, like any grand tale of power and control, Marcos's reign was not without its dark underbelly. Allegations of corruption and nepotism were rampant during his rule, and for good reason. It wasn't just about the consolidation of power, it was about the accumulation of wealth. Marcos and his close associates allegedly pilfered billions of dollars from the state coffers, making him one of the wealthiest men in Asia at the time. The funds were used to finance lavish lifestyles, extravagant parties, and grandiose construction projects, many of which bore the Marcos name. This was corruption on an unprecedented scale, a brazen display of power and wealth that left a significant portion of the population in abject poverty. And then there was the nepotism. Marcos was not one to keep his power confined to himself. He spread it among his family and close friends, appointing them to key positions in the government and military. His wife, Imelda, was given significant political power, while his cronies were placed in charge of large state-owned corporations. This created a network of loyalists who would protect and uphold Marcos's rule at all costs. This intricate web of corruption and nepotism did more than just enrich Marcos and his associates. It also helped to consolidate his power. By controlling the country's wealth and placing loyalists in key positions, Marcos ensured that any opposition was swiftly quashed and dissenting voices were silenced. It was a masterclass in autocratic rule, one that kept Marcos in power for over 2 decades. Yet this level of corruption and nepotism was not without its consequences. It led to widespread discontent, economic instability, and ultimately the erosion of Marcos's power base. The very tools that Marcos used to maintain his grip on power would also contribute to his downfall. Corruption and nepotism were key tools in Marcos's arsenal, but his rule was not to last forever. Every reign has an end, so what led to the downfall of Marcos? The fall of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. was brewing amidst a sea of discontent. His long rule, marked by authoritarianism and corruption, had begun to wear thin on the Filipino people. But it was the assassination of Benigno Aquino Jr., a prominent opposition leader and vocal critic of Marcos, that set the stage for the end of Marcos's rule. In August 1983, Aquino was gunned down at the Manila International Airport upon his return from exile. This event triggered widespread outrage and protests. Aquino's death became a symbol of the people's fight against Marcos's regime, and it galvanized a wave of resistance that would eventually culminate in the People Power Revolution. In February 1986, millions of Filipinos took to the streets in a peaceful protest that lasted 4 days. This was the People Power Revolution, a non-violent demonstration of the collective will of the people, demanding an end to Marcos's rule. The world watched as nuns, priests, students and everyday citizens stood together, armed not with guns but with flowers, rosaries and their unwavering belief in democracy. Faced with this massive display of civil disobedience, Marcos was left with little choice. On the 25th of February, he fled the country, seeking exile in Hawaii. Thus ended Marcos's 20-year rule, leaving behind a nation scarred by years of dictatorship, but also a people united in their pursuit of freedom and democracy. Marcos's rule was marked by controversy and ended in revolution. But what can we take away from this period in history? History is a mirror, reflecting not just the actions of leaders, but also the power of the people to bring about change. The fall of Marcos serves as a poignant reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of peaceful protest. Remember, every reign has an end, and often it's the people who write the final chapter. Marcos' 20-year rule was a significant period in the Philippines' history, but what lessons can we learn from it? Beginning with his early years in power, Marcos' ambition and political savvy set the stage for a lengthy rule. His implementation of martial law and authoritarian practices, however, marked a dark period filled with human rights abuses and suppression of democratic freedoms. The rampant corruption and nepotism that became synonymous with his regime further highlighted the pitfalls of unchecked power, leading to his eventual downfall. Yet, despite the negative aspects of his rule, Marcos's reign also offers a cautionary tale for other nations. The importance of transparency, accountability, and the rule of law becomes evident when reflecting upon the Marcos era. It underscores the need for vigilant citizenry and robust institutions to safeguard democratic principles. Remember, history often repeats itself. It's our duty to learn from it and prevent the same mistakes in the future.